Hey guys, so we are going to do our best at attempting to talk through this PowerPoint. Young homie is chilling in his playroom next door, so at some point in time you might hear him coming in and talking, and we'll just work our way through it, okay? So I wanted to talk through the next section about fish specifically. So fish are part of phylum Chordata, meaning that they meet all the requirements of a chordate, subphylum Vertebrata. So they are believed to be our first evolved vertebrates and the closest evolutionary link to invertebrate animals, specifically when we get into class Agnatha. But for now, if you take a look at this diagram in this image here, you can see some of the major characteristics of fish. Fins, specifically the lack of hair and fur and the presence of scales, and then also the development of gills from the pharyngeal slits. If you think through all of the possible classifications of fish, they may seem to have very little in common because they are highly diverse. However, all fish are cold-blooded, they lay eggs, they are finned, and they are fully aquatic. They do breathe through passing water across their gills. And when we focus in on the whole egg-laying aspect, some fish are called live bearers, and we will talk about that a little bit later. But I specifically want to point out that when I say live bearer, I do not mean that they give birth in the same manner as like an animal or a mammal or a human. In terms of our live bearer fish, they actually are something called oviviparous, which essentially they lay eggs internally, those eggs hatch and develop, and then are released to the aquatic environment looking like juveniles or mini adults. There are three major classes of fish that we're going to talk about: class Agnatha, class Chondrichthyes, and class Osteichthyes. If you look at our little diagram here, you can see some examples of those types of organisms. Agnatha would be your jawless fish, Chondrichthyes are cartilaginous fish, and then Osteichthyes are your bony fish specifically. So class Agnatha is the most primitive of your fish classes. They are the most primitive, and they are definitely the oldest evolutionarily. They are actually believed to have evolved during the late Cambrian period, which is about 500 million years ago. So that's a pretty significant change in evolutionary history, going from invertebrates to vertebrate animals. Jawless fish are related to infraphylum Hyprotreti. Those are your hagfish. True Agnathas are lampreys, and they are different from your Hyprotreti organisms in that they do have gills versus pharyngeal slits. So that's kind of why some people are not sure whether or not hagfish count as Agnatha, and some then class them in their own Hyprotreti infraphylum. Assuming we're lumping them all together at this point in time, you are classifying and identifying these organisms specifically based on their body shape and their mouths. So they are very snake or eel-like in their shape. They are not related to eels. They are very distant from the eels. However, they have a similar body shape. They also have no paired fins, and they don't have a true belly, no true ventral side. Like I said, they're very tube-esque. They do have three eyes called pineal eyes. They allow them to see a little bit, but they are typically blind to all but light sensitivity. In terms of their mouths, if you look in the center picture, they're very much sucker organisms. So they have teeth that are more like hooks that hook into the prey, and then a probe-like tongue that drills into the organism and then withdraws the blood to essentially drink their blood. My class Chondrichthyes, or my cartilaginous fish, these are going to be sharks and rays and skates. They do have a vertebral column. Obviously, they're vertebrates, but they do have highly cartilaginous skeletons, meaning that most of their bones are not ossified. They're also covered in something called dermal teeth or placoid scales, and these are made of enamel just like teeth, and they allow for protection for the shark or the ray, but also it allows them to cut through the water very seamlessly and reduces friction when swimming. If you were to run your hand across the outside of a shark in the wrong direction, even though it would look like it would feel kind of slimy, it's actually more like sandpaper in its feeling because of these dermal teeth. In terms of the actual physical mouth teeth of your shark, they develop very differently than human teeth that you're used to. You're used to having baby teeth that then fall out and you get your adult teeth, versus teeth in sharks develop continuously over time. When a tooth gets too old or worn, it falls out and a new teeth almost immediately takes its place. It's a very cool process. They also don't have swim bladders. So the swim bladder is a gas-filled sac that takes up a large portion of the center of the fish, and it allows it to remain buoyant and essentially maintain its position in the water column very easily. Sharks don't have that, which means they are going to swim very continuously. Some people say that sharks don't sleep. Some sharks do, but they actually go through more of like restful and wakeful periods. However, the lack of swim bladder does require a lot of constant swimming on the part of the shark. Here's a picture of those placoid scales or those dermal teeth. And then we're going to talk about reproduction a little bit. So in chondriichthyes males specifically, their pectoral fin is modified to be something called a clasper, which is a reproductive organ. You are going to have internal fertilization, and they can be oviparous or oviviparous. And essentially that just goes into whether or not the eggs are laid and externally hatched versus internal hatching. All sharks are really predatory. Rays and skates are predatory as well. They are classified as carnivorous. However, there is now evidence of a few rare classes of sharks or individual sharks that actually do eat vegetation just as a part of their diet. Bony fish, largest vertebrate class, 29,000 different species. They have ossified bony skeletons and they do have jaws. These are what you typically think of when you think of fish, okay? They do not have those dermal scales. They have true scales now, and they have their paired fins. They also have something called an operculum, which is a bony flap that is protecting the gills. Some call it a gill cover. They are characterized by their lateral line. So this is a line that goes lengthwise across the body and is composed of sensory organs called neuromasts. And these help the fish to sense vibration in the water, pressure change, and it is essentially a protective adaptation. I'm going to go check on my child.
I'm going to a field.
I see that you are doing that. Well, be careful, please.
I'm going to a field so I can lay down there.
Right on. Get after it. Okay, so picking up with bony fish, the vast majority of species in osteichthyes have external fertilization, and it's very, very impersonal. So typically this is a process called spawning, and it is very random. So the female will produce a bunch of eggs into the water, males will produce a bunch of sperm, and hope for the best, and hope that they will encounter each other and fertilization takes place. This also means that there's going to be very little parental care. In a lot of cases, eggs and sperm are released and you hope for the best. And if it develops and survives, awesome. And if not, you would never know the difference if you're the fish. In other cases, which we'll talk about a little bit later, there is very minor parental care, but overall, fish do not practice parental care strategies. In terms of their eating, bony fish can be anywhere from herbivore, carnivore, omnivore. They are so diverse and there are so many different types that it's all over the board here. For senses, they have all 5 and they practice all of them frequently. Eyesight is huge for fish, specifically those who live deep in dark areas of the water. So they are going to need to adjust to the lack of light or the intensity of the light. And so something that allows that to happen is actually a specialized eye structure called the tapetum lucidum, and it essentially allows them to amplify and reflect available light, which is why if you took an underwater photo of a shark, it looks like their eyes are glowing. Also cats have this too. So then fish locomotion. Why are fish so highly adapted to a life underwater? One, it's their streamlined body shape. They are designed in a way that cuts through water and allows them to swim really easily. They also have secretions that lubricate their scales and allow them to reduce friction when cutting through the water. And also that swim bladder, the presence of something that allows for built-in buoyancy and allows them to really float in their environment is huge. Also, the way their muscles are formed. So think striations of muscle. If you were to take a salmon fillet and look at it, maybe you've noticed this almost zigzag anterior to posterior pattern. And what this really does is it allows for lots of connections between muscle fibers and the organ, like the fin, that's going to cause the motion. So with every fin movement, you're going to have a huge contraction of muscle. And that really allows for small motions to propel the organism forward with maximum propulsion. In terms of behavior, we're going to talk about 3 final things: brooding, schooling, and shoaling. Brooding is a behavioral adaptation that allows for some parental care of organisms. You're going to see it in seahorses, other fish, and typically it's done by the males of the species, which is actually really interesting. So male seahorses have a pouch on their belly where the juveniles will kind of chill and hang out until they're ready to survive on their own. Some fish will store their fertilized eggs in their mouth, and it just increases the likelihood of survival. So in organisms that have this, there is a much higher juvenile or egg to adult survival rate. Ignore my email. Schooling, think Finding Nemo when you have the big group of fish that forms the giant fish and tries to talk. This is when a lot of fish work and swim and live together in a large group in order to deter predators. So this is actually practiced by 80% of juvenile fish and up to 20% of adult species. So it's very highly used. And it just coordinates numbers of fish in a consistent pattern to convince a predator that either 1, you shouldn't attack us, or 2, it confuses them. Child coming. You want to go downstairs? Okay. If you go in your playroom and play for 5 minutes, then we will go down, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Shoaling, similar to schooling, but for social reasons. This increases mating efficiency, and it works very similarly to the schooling aspect, but now this is more socially driven. So some fish are social creatures, and shoaling is their way of expressing that. And that brings us to the end of our little PowerPoint. Thanks for hanging in there with me and my kid. I know that this is a weird time for everybody, and we're just going to do our best to get through it. Please ask questions if you have them. Focus on for this week. I'd like you to finish these notes that we're talking about, and then I'd also like you to start working on those Agnatha YouTube videos and their analysis questions. Look out for a message from me later this week in regards to a quiz over this week's material.